Hello and welcome to the second episode of Dex Techs. I'm your host, the Casual Dex, and today we'll be diving into the cruel, gruel world of Magic the Social Distancing with our next commander, Radha, Heart of Keld. This commander costs 1 and gruel colors for a 3/3 elf warrior with as long as it's our turn. Radha, Heart of Keld has first strike. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play lands from the top of our library. Radha also has an activatable ability for 4 colorless and gruel colors, where Radha gets +X until end of turn, where X is equal to the number of lands we control. We can activate this ability multiple times per turn, and with enough mana available, we can dish out a Radha damage. First Strike is a great mechanic, especially if you need to deal with some keywords like Death Touch or Wither, but we also want to add some Trample in here, so that we can get some damage through when we attack, even if the opponent has some blockers available. This deck also runs with a Hydra sub-theme, and really likes to jump big into the big scary creature side of Gruul to pair with the amount of explosive mana we're likely going to have access to. This also has a secret commander, but to really make that one pop, we would probably want to switch out our Hydras for some elementals, but we'll get to that later. This deck runs a total of 42 lands, with 15 forests, 12 mountains, and one of each snow-covered basics within Gruul colors. We have a lot of basic lands in this deck due to a lot of our spells grabbing basic lands from our library, and we want to have a lot of landfall triggers, so lands that can cause multiple landfall triggers in one turn are always going to be better. I know the fetch lands are absolutely brutal here, but let's keep things cheap with some basic fetches like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. Both of these can be sacrificed to bring out any color basic land card from our library onto the battlefield tapped. Fabled Passage does the same thing, but if we control 4 or more lands, we can untap that basic we just got to fish out. Pair these with something that lets us cast lands from our graveyard, like Remnant Excavator or Splendid Reclamation, or maybe something that lets us play multiple lands per turn, like Azusa Lost but Seeking or Min and Den Wildborn, to really get ourselves several land triggers per turn, all while filtering through our deck for all of the basic lands that we want to get out early. Myriad Landscape enters tapped, but if we pay 2 and sack it, we can snatch up 2 more basic lands from our library that enter tapped and then shuffle the library. Field of the Dead is an interesting land that enters tapped, but when it or another land enters the battlefield under our control, we create a 2/2 black zombie creature token if we control 7 or more lands with different names. Kessig Wolf Run taps for a colorless, but the part we really care about with this land is its cost for X and Gruul colors, and to tap it, we can give target creature +X/+0 and trample until end of turn. Mosswort Bridge and Spine Rock Knoll are 2 very interesting hideaway lands that provide access to one of their respective Gruul colors. When one of these enters play, you look at the top 4 of your library and you may exile one of them face down. For the cost of a green and tap Mosswort Bridge, it will allow you to play that exiled card without paying its mana cost, as long as creatures we control power totals 10 or greater. And Spine Rock Knoll does the same, but only if an opponent took 7 or more damage this turn. This does see damage from all sources, and as long as an opponent took 7 or more damage at minimum on this turn, or any turn, you may be able to cast that card. Some of the other helpful lands we have running are Command Tower, which gives us access to any 1 mana within our color identity within our commander. Gruul Turf enters tapped with access to either the Gruul colors, but we have to return a land we control to its owner's hand when this is put into play. Shimmering Grotto and Unknown Shores both give us colorless, or for 1 mana we can add 1 mana of any color to our pool. Temple of Abandon enters tapped, and lets us scry 1 when it enters play. Getting basic should be no problem in this deck, but if you really want one of the utility lands in this deck, you can use Crop Rotation to sack a land and grab any land from our library into play untapped and then shuffle the library. Every Elvish Warrior needs a tool belt, so let's see what Radha's packing. Adventure Gear costs 1 to equip, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, the equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. We also have Basilisk Collar, which costs 2 to equip and grants the equipped creature Death Touch as well as Lifelink. Lightning Greaves costs 0 to equip and gives the creature it's attached to haste as well as Shroud, but be careful with what you attach this to and when you attach it to it, because this does make this creature untargetable even by our own spells. Shadow Spear is a nasty little weapon that equips for 2 and gives the equipped creature +1/+1 as well as Trample and Lifelink. And for the cost of 1 mana, this can also cause permanents our opponents control to lose hexproof as well as indestructible. Cindervines will cause our opponent's spells to come with the cost of 1 damage whenever that opponent casts a non-creature spell, and for 1 and sacrifice Cindervines, we destroy target artifact or equipment, and Cindervines will deal 2 damage to that permanent's controller as well. Rhythm of the Wild will cause creature spells we control unable to be countered, and grants non-token creatures we control Riot. This allows us to give a creature a +1/+1 counter or haste when it enters play, as long as it's a non-token creature. Chaos Warp will shuffle target permanent into its owner's library, and then that player reveals the top of their library. If that top card is a permanent, then they do get to put it into the battlefield. Heroic Intervention gives permanents we control hexproof as well as indestructible until end of turn at instant speed, which always comes in handy. Return to Nature I feel belongs in every deck with green, as a choose 1 instant with options including destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from a graveyard. This is cheap removal and can be used at instant speed and has multiple options to choose from. What more could you really ask for from a common? Scavenging Ooze is a 2/2 that loves an easy meal from the grave, and at the cost of 1 green mana, we can use its ability to exile target card from a graveyard. If that card happens to be a creature card, we also get to put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze, and we gain 1 life. In true red fashion, we are also running Vandal Blast, a sorcery that lets us destroy target artifact we don't control, but it also has an overload cost for 4 and a red to change its text from reading target to each. And in an emergency, it's a 1 mana destroy artifact, but what we really care about here is crippling our opponents running artifacts for fixing and ramp by casting this for its overload cost. Now let's shift focus into some good old ramp with Cultivate. This spell lets us search our library for up to 2 basics. We reveal those cards and put 1 into play tapped, and 1 into our hand, then shuffle the library. RO makes us sack a land for an additional cost, but it pulls up 2 basics into play untapped, and we get another library shuffle. Secure a Tribe Elder can be sacrificed to search our library for a basic land card into play tapped. Scaretiller lets us choose 1 when it becomes tapped, with our options including put a land from our hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return a land from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Soul Ring, because Soul Ring. When Springbloom Druid enters the battlefield, we may sacrifice a land to search up 2 basic lands into play tapped. Dockside Extortionist is an artifact player's nightmare on a body that reads, when Dockside Extortionist enters the battlefield, create X treasure tokens, where X equals the number of artifacts and enchantments our opponents control. A lot of people are going to look to ramp early, and a lot of people also run a lot of low converted mana cost artifacts for fixing, and counting in any enchantments they control on top of it is just icing on the mana cake, because each of these treasure tokens can be sacrificed for a mana of any color. This next section is what I'm going to call Hangry Hungry Hydras, starting with Gargos Vicious Watcher. This 8/7 Hydra has Vigilance and makes our Hydra spells we cast cost 4 less. That's never going to be a bad thing. Love it. When a creature we control becomes the target of a spell, Gargos will also fight another target creature we don't control, so opponents are going to think twice before trying to use any removal on this creature, or at least targeted removal. Genesis Hydra costs X green to cast, and enters with X 1/1 counters on it. With a bonus of getting to reveal the top X cards of our library, we may then put a non-land permanent with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield, then shuffle the library. Ironskill Hydra is a creature that doesn't care about combat damage at all. If a creature would deal combat damage to Ironskill Hydra, prevent that damage and put a +1/+1 counter on Ironskill Hydra. Just leave this one as a blocker for a little bit, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger until you can grant it trample and take someone out with it. Savageborn Hydra has Double Strike and is another 0/0 Hydra that costs X in Google colors that enters with X 1/1 counters on it. This also has an ability for 1 and red or green to put an additional +1/+1 counter on Savageborn Hydra, but we can only do this at any time that we would cast a sorcery. Wrapping up our Hydras is we have Voracious Hydra with a 0/1 and trample with the cost of X green, and it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and our choice of doubling the number of +1/+1 counters on Voracious Hydra, or we can make it fight an additional creature we don't control. Now, we've gone over all of the lands, ramp, and other ways to abuse Landfall, but we've yet to go over any of the actual Landfall cards in the deck. Starting our dive into this mechanic we will absolutely be abusing today, we have Avenger of Zendikar. When this creature enters play, we create a 0/1 green plant creature token for every land we control, and when a land enters play, we will put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control. This also counts our plant Hydra as well, so keep an eye for that one. Forcer of Crufix makes us play with the top card of our library revealed, but we may play the top card as long as it's a land, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we will gain a life. Evolution Sage technically is not landfall, but triggers the same way, and when it does, it'll proliferate. On each trigger, this allows us to pick any number of permanents or players with counters on them, and then add an additional counter of each kind already there. Raising Gladeheart gains us 2 life on landfall triggers. Omnath Locus of Rage is our secret commander that creates a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token for every landfall trigger we get, and whenever Omnath Locus of Rage or another elemental dies, it deals 3 damage to target player or creature. Once this is in play, we're going to want to trigger landfall as many times as possible before it's removed, because this creates a ton of blockers for us, and if an opponent manages to kill them, we can just bolt them for every one, or just burn down some of the problem creatures on the board. Oran Reef Hydra is a 5/5 with trample, and on its landfall trigger we put a 1/1 counter on Oran Reef Hydra. If that land happens to be a forest, we will put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead. Rampaging Baloths is a 6/6 with trample, and if we trigger its landfall ability, we will create a 4/4 beast creature token. Retreat to Kazandu lets us choose one on landfall between a 1/1 counter on target creature, or gain 2 life. Retreat of Valakut is the red alternative to Kazandu, with its choices including giving a creature +2/+0 until end of turn, or making target creature unblockable. Seer Sundial allows us to pay 2 on each landfall trigger to draw a card. Tunneling Geopede is digging into being a little more of a problem if we can trigger it a few times and just ping each opponent for 1 on every trigger. Undergrowth Champion is another creature that just doesn't care about damage, because as long as at least 1 +1/+1 counter is on it, if damage is dealt to Undergrowth Champion, we just remove one of those 1/1 counters. Its nasty landfall trigger also just happens to allow us to put a +1/+1 counter on Undergrowth Champion for every landfall trigger, so this won't stay a 2/2 for long. Moving into the final section of this deck, we have a few cards that I will refer to as the Powerhouse Cards. These are the cards that just do awesome things for our deck and really abuse our opponents and enable a lot of nonsense that we want to be pulling throughout the game, starting with Aether Vial. This 1 mana artifact lets us put a charge counter on Aether Vial at the beginning of our upkeep, and we can tap it to put a creature from our hand onto the battlefield as long as its converted mana cost matches the number of charge counters on Aether Vial. Granted, this can do a lot more in other decks, but it costs 1, and it either demands removal to be burnt, or we're going to start dropping free creatures into play pretty quickly. Beastmaster Ascension gets a quest counter whenever a creature we control attacks, and once we have 7 or more quest counters on this enchantment, creatures we control get +5/+5. Comet Storm is an X red instant with a multi-kicker for 1, which allows us to choose any target and deal X damage to it, or if we paid its multi-kicker cost, we can select that many targets, including opponents, so if we have enough mana available, we can either use it to get rid of some problem creatures on the board, or just blast our opponents directly in the face. Dragon Master Outcast creates a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying at the beginning of our upkeep as long as we control 6 or more lands, which really shouldn't be difficult to achieve in this deck. Elder Gargaroth is an all-around good creature card, has a 6/6 with vigilance, reach, as well as trample, and whenever it attacks or blocks, we get to choose one. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token. We gain 3 life, or we can draw a card. Garruk's Uprising is a crazy enchantment that really likes the number 4. When this enters the battlefield, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we may draw a card. This also grants creatures we control trample, and whenever a creature enters play under our control, if it has 4 power or greater, we also get to draw an additional card. Ilharg the Raised Boar is a 6/6 with trample, but the real reason we have this in here is when we send out the boar to attack, we can put a creature from our hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and then return that creature to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. When Ilharg the Raised Boar dies, or is exiled from the battlefield, we may put it in our library 3rd from the top. Nissa, Who Shakes the World, is the only planeswalker we have in the deck, but it has a static ability where when we tap a forest for mana, we can add an additional green mana to it. This comes into play with 5 loyalty, and the +1 has us put 3 +1/+1 counters on target land we control, untap it, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental with haste that still counts as a land. The other ability on this walker is a -8 that allows us to search our library for any number of forest cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, and gives all of our lands indestructible. If we can pull off the -8 on this card, we will get a bunch of landfall triggers, and give our lands indestructible is always going to be a bonus. Nylea's Intervention is an XX green sorcery that has 2 options. We can either search our library for X land cards, reveal them, and put them into our hand, or Nylea's Intervention deals twice X damage to target creature with flying. Getting a few lands to our hand always comes in handy in this deck, but having the option to snipe down an opponent's flyer is never a bad thing either. Nyx Bloom Ancient is a 5/5 with trample that our opponents will immediately start talking amongst themselves because it allows you to triple your mana whenever you tap a permanent. Mana tripler, it might not be allowed to stay in play for very long. Overwhelming Stampede grants creatures we control +X/+X as well as trample, where X is the greatest power amongst these creatures. Primal Might costs X and a green to give target creature +X/+X until end of turn, then this creature fights target creature we don't control. Scape Shift is just a beautiful card with a beautiful effect that just screams Landfall to me. When we cast this spell, we can sacrifice any number of lands. We then search our library for lands equal to the number of lands we've sacrificed, and put them all into play tapped. The idea is to ramp out like crazy with basics, and then once we have a decent amount of landfall triggers in play, we can cast this and just bomb the board with triggers, and get several, if not all, of our non-basic lands all at the same time. This is easily the best card in the deck if played with the right timing and setup, so be sure to wait until after all of the counterspells stop flying to try to cast this. Seedborn Muse is another creature your opponents might start making deals with each other over, being as it just allows us to untap all of the permanents we control during each of our opponent's upkeep. This is like a pseudo-vigilance for our creatures we attacked with, so we constantly have blockers available, and opens up all of our mana to protect ourselves or to sink a bunch of mana into some abilities if we need to, or honestly just sometimes having a ton of mana open is enough to deter potential problems from our opponents. Shared Summons also allows us to tutor 2 creatures with different names to our hand, but we do have to reveal them, so I suggest waiting until you have enough mana to open to cast them quickly before someone wheels them away or makes you discard them. Vizier of the Menagerie lets us look at the top card of our library at any time, and if the top card is a creature card, we may cast it from the top, and we may spend mana as if it were any color to cast creature spells. Warstorm Surge is our final card on the list, and it's here purely to throw salt in the wound, because with this in play, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it deals damage equal to the power to any target. Play nice and pick off a creature here, or just send all the damage right into the face of our now pleading for a deal opponent. I have personally never built using red before, so building this deck was a bit of a head scratcher for me on how I wanted to approach it, but I knew as soon as I saw this commander from Core Set 2021 that I had to build it. The deck had to include disgusting amounts of damage, as well as landfall as an absolute must mechanic, especially with all of the lands we're going to be throwing into play. If you're planning on swapping out the Hydras to better embrace Omnath as a secret commander in this deck, I would recommend swapping out our 6 Hydras for Rubble Hulk, Living Twister, Thicket Crasher, Flamekin Harbinger, Phyto Titan, and Multani Yavmaya's Avatar. Without rebuilding the entire deck to work around Omnath Locust of Rage specifically, I feel these are the most synergistic elementals we could swap out our Hydras for, or you could honestly look for a couple of elemental creature token makers to be able to just spit them out. Thank you all for watching and supporting this channel, it means a lot to me. The response to our first episode of Dex Techs was amazing, so I'll be sure to keep this series going for the foreseeable future. This has been another episode of Dex Techs, and I'm your host, The Casual Dex. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and enjoy your day, and I'll see y'all soon in the next episode.